indicated very clearly that we want state-owned enterprises and companies to be governed well, to rid themselves of state capture and corrupt practices, to place themselves on a sustainable financial footing, and where necessary to review, my apologies for that, to review the operating models of these entities. And we've repeatedly said, both in our budget vote and in various statements from government, that state-owned enterprises have a crucial role to play both in our economy, but also in respect of the development challenges that our country has. If you look at the economic front, it's in relation to Eskom, the supply of a consistent amount of electricity that both industry and households need. If you look at big entities like Transnet, the logistics of transporting not only mineral resources to export destinations, but also to various power stations in our country, and importantly, the transport of manufactured and other goods that we want to export out of the country as well. You've had a recent instance, I think yesterday, of a mining company indicating that derailment on a particular line had resulted in less volumes of that company being exported in respect of iron ore. And it's an example of the failure to operate efficiently and its implications for public entities, but also for the economy more generally as well. So in line with that, Cabinet yesterday made a number of decisions in relation to boards and the entities, and it's just a reminder that this is this minister's 86th day in office. It's the President's, I think, 97th day in office. So the following are the announcements we want to share with you, and you'll get copies of this statement in a moment. Firstly, in relation to Eskom, Cabinet has confirmed the appointment of a CEO recommended by the board of Eskom, that is the new board. So the new chief executive, in other words, no longer interim executive, chief executive is Mr. Phakamani Hadebe. And as we are talking to you, this announcement is also being shared with the Eskom staff at their head office in Megawatt Park. In the short period that Mr. Hadebe has been in office, he's, together with the board, made some important advances, particularly in relation to ensuring that those, or some of those, who have been guilty of malfeasance, which was exposed both in the parliamentary inquiry and by some of the good work that you've been doing as investigative journalists, have either resigned or they're going through disciplinary processes. Secondly, they've started introducing good governance practices within the institution itself. Thirdly, they've been looking at their finances and are now able to borrow from capital markets. And Mr. Hadebe's experience, both at the Land Bank and at the Treasury, and his stint at a banking institution, places him in a good position, together with a team that the board will put together to steer Eskom out of where it finds itself today and stabilize the institution and position it for the kind of role that it plays in our economy and in our society as well. The second is the finalization of the board, a new board for SA Express. The old board's mandate expired on the 21st of May, and the new board includes the following individuals. Ms. Trifosa Romano, she's, I think, CFO at PPC, used to be deputy chair at SAA, and she's the new chairperson of SA Express. And then you have a number of individuals whose abbreviated CVs will be given to you. Mr. Khomo, Ms. January McLean, Mr. Theva, Mr. Lamola, Mr. Mpondo, Ms. Makatini, Ms. Dr. Leoka, and Mr. Basa. And these individuals have a mix of aviation experience, audit and accountancy backgrounds, HR backgrounds, and engineering backgrounds, and legal backgrounds. Mr. Basa also sits on the SAA board. So what we have here is a connection and cross-fertilization between the SAA board and the SA Express board as we begin to position ourselves to merge the three state-owned entities, SA Express, Mango, and SAA. Now, SA Express has been in dire straits for some time, and some publications over the last week or so have given you an indication of the extent of malfeasance that has been taking place there. Last week, I had to make a decision with the senior management at the department to put in an intervention team. And the job of this intervention team for the last week or so has been to really get into deep technical matters and tell us the truth of what is really going on. In other words, what's the technical capacity in this institution? What kind of malfeasance is actually going on? And there's one or two examples I'll share with you later. And do we have competent people to do the work that we actually need to do? You know that SA Express has had a number of failures over the last couple of weeks, let alone the last couple of years. And we hope we can get this right. But we must also share with you that the Civil Aviation Authority has been undertaking an investigation or inspection, I think is what they call it, at SA Express, and they might give some views in respect of their findings later today. We also announced on the 14th of May an interim board. And the reason we announce interim boards after consultation with the President is to respond to crises as they emerge at each of these institutions. And as soon as it is possible, these matters are then taken to Cabinet for confirmation. So the new Transnet board has been confirmed. The chair of the new Transnet board, as you will see in your statement, or copy of your statement, is Mr. Popo Molefe, and he is joined on the board by Ms. Letlape, who's a very seasoned executive, formerly at Eskom, at the University of Johannesburg, and will have a lot to offer in this regard to Transnet. Mr. Louis van Zeyne, who was Deputy CEO, I think, at one of our banking institutions, is retired, and he's responded to the Tumamina call, and he has vast experience in audit, risk management, and financial management. Ms. Fikelepi is a lawyer. Ms. Matsoka is an engineer. Ms. Ganda is an accountant. Professor Kiswita was formerly an Eskom power station manager and an engineer, and more recently is the former chief executive of Alexander Forbes. Mr. Ramabulana, I think, has engineering experience. Mr. Dr. Mufamadi will introduce leadership and governance and ethics dimension into this board. Ms. McMenamin is an economist, currently with Mondi. Edward Motaung is obviously a lawyer, and Ms. Gratitude Rampaka is also an accountant. And they will be joined by the chief executive of Transnet, Mr. Gama, and at the moment, as you know, we have an acting CFO in Mr. Mohammadi, and the new board will be given the responsibility to start the process of appointing a permanent CFO. We then come to Denel. On the 9th of April, we announced the new board of directors for Denel, and Cabinet yesterday approved the additional board members and the board itself. So Ms. Montla Tlatla remains chairperson, and she is accompanied by Ms. Yatula, who's an accountant, Mr. Mnisi, who's a lawyer, Mr. Kunene, who has a vast business experience, previous experience in Denel, and he's also got a legal background. Professor Marwala is Vice Chancellor at University of Johannesburg, and let's call it he's a computer scientist and mathematician. There are two former generals of the SANDF, Lieutenant General Matanzima and General Sipiwe Nyanda, who will bring in their experience in terms of what our defense force needs and get the synergies between the defense force and Denel right, so that Denel is able to respond to its major customer, which is our own defense force. Dr. Sirobe is also a very experienced business person. Mr. Sadiq is an accountant and also has some experience at Denel in his previous life. Ms. Rapkin has been an advisor to 3 successive ministers of defense and brings her wisdom and experience to the board. Dr. Sibisi is the former CEO of CSIR and currently executive director of the Wits Business School. So both science and business knowledge is what he will bring. Mr. Magazi, I think, is a lawyer. Dr. Nell is an engineer. And Ms. Leshloenya is an accountant as well. Now, each of these boards, some of whom I've met and some of whom I will now meet in their full form, are mandated to do, amongst other things, very clearly the following. They must undertake their duties diligently and ensure that the kind of fiduciary responsibilities that the Companies Act and the Memorandum of Incorporation and the Shareholder Compact imposes upon them is executed with absolute integrity. They must reinstill an ethical culture into state-owned entities. Clearly, we've lost a lot of ground in this particular regard. And the malfeasance that all of us know about and the consequences of state capture run quite deep. And once you have such a deep culture of malfeasance, it takes a tremendous effort on the part not just of the board, but of senior managers to get this process right. They must ensure good governance, accountability, and transparency. And here, what we want to introduce over a short period of time is that if there's, for example, a forensic report, it must be made public. So all of us know exactly what the forensic report said, whom have they found what evidence against, who must be further investigated, so that we don't have to make you work too hard to get leaks from anybody. You should be able to supply it to you on the table. And similarly, in the procurement area, we also want greater transparency and accountability. In some instances, it happens, and as you know, there have been major transactions running into hundreds of billions of rands at state-owned entities, which have very questionable processes. And excuse me. And these are things that should become matters of the past as we go along. We want to also try and encourage the right kind of relationship between boards and management. We've come across in interviewing board members of previous boards and a tendency to begin to assume operational responsibility. And sometimes it would appear it's to spend time at the entity so that they can earn more fees. Now, this is not what we want. If you're a board member, do your board work. If there is a necessity to intervene, let us know at the department and ministry, and we'll see how best to go about it. Of course, this is not, there are gray zones in this area, so we must actually understand that. They must investigate any allegations of corruption and ensure that where there's evidence of malfeasance, they deal with that evidence decisively. And where necessary, charges must be laid against individuals or entities that have benefited improperly from dubious procurement contracts with the Hawks and other sections of the police. Secondly, we expect that the prosecution authority will send out a positive and strong signal that they will act when there is the right amount of evidence prepared against individuals and entities that have been involved in malfeasance. But thirdly, the boards will also be asked to ensure that where funds are known to have left that particular entity, that those funds must be tracked down and brought back home. So recovering monies that have been lost is going to be an important function of these boards. But while they look at the past, in relation to corruption, they've also got to ensure in many of these entities that they have a keen understanding of what is happening financially. What's the cost base of the entity? What's the revenue potential and reality in each of these entities? And where are the operational efficiencies that are not being introduced, which could make a difference to the financial status of the entities themselves? We've also got to ensure that the companies do what they do in an effective and efficient way and in a financially sustainable way. And I think there needs to be a greater understanding amongst these entities that they are crucial to the South African economy in one way or the other. And that they must take responsibility for the kind of path that the President has set in terms of targets of growth, of job creation, and of inskilling people, of employing interns, and training young people in particular so that our economy has the right amount of skills, particularly in relation to the functions that these people are responsible for. The boards will also look at the executive management teams at each of these institutions. As you know, over a period of time, state capture was also about not just replacing boards with appropriate people, that appropriate meaning appropriate to the state capture objective. It was also about removing good, honest managers and replacing them. And there are many instances of that in the SOEs that account to us. So the boards must look at the executive management teams and make sure that they are individuals with absolute integrity, good business and personal integrity and ethics, and are there to serve the public cause, because essentially these are all public servants at the end of the day. And finally, the job of the boards would be to ensure that they once again establish a good name for the particular entity that they operate in, both in respect of the employees, the stakeholders of those entities, people who lend money to those entities, and above all, the South African public. I think SOEs have earned a bad name for themselves over a period of time, and this is a wonderful opportunity for leaders who occupy positions on the board to shape the way in which not only how these entities operate, but how they're perceived by the public themselves. There are still two entities that we haven't got to yet. One is SAFCO, and the other is Alexco. And when we are ready, we'll make some announcements in that regard as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. We'll provide you with the profiles of the new board members. Okay, questions? Linda? Yes. And Paul? Yeah. We'll take the first round and then come back with the second round with 4 other people. Linda?
Thank you, Minister. Linda Insor, Business Day. Just 3 questions, if you don't mind. SA Express recently expressed an urgent need for cash, otherwise it's not going to be able to pay its suppliers. What's in the offing there? I mean, have you decided on any bailout? If you could clarify the commitment letter that you gave to SAA, what it contained and why it was necessary. And in your list of directors for SA Express, Ronald Lamola, I mean, as far as I know, he's a prominent ANC member. Was that the reason why he was appointed? Thanks.
Minister Jan Lange from Report. Yesterday's news about municipalities and last week's session about the the debt of the municipal debt to Eskom, there was a decision by the Portfolio Committee, by SCOPA, that an interministerial committee will be approached and to try and find a solution to this. I assume that you will probably be part of that interministerial committee. Can you give us an indication what are the options for this? Municipalities are more than 40% of Eskom's clients, buy more than 40% of their product, and they are clearly not able to repay their debt. Secondly, SA Express, is it still the intention to merge SA Express with SAA and Kalula and Mango? Does it make sense? Because wouldn't SA Express make the problems at SAE worse than it was? And is it the intention that SAA will come back to your portfolio?
Okay, Paul.
Good morning, Minister. Paul Vecchiota from Bloomberg. Just first of all, your predecessor in this position complained that it was very difficult to get people onto the boards because of the reputations of the state-owned companies. How difficult was it to get people, and are you satisfied you're getting the right types of people onto the boards now? Then secondly, what steps will be taken to reduce Eskom's risk to the fiscus? Doesn't necessarily mean reducing the risk, the debt, but the risk to the fiscus, which was identified as the immediate predecessor finance minister as the biggest risk to the country's fiscus. Thank you.
Donald. Minister. Yeah, Donald, go ahead.
Donald Presley from The Messenger. Minister, I've been around the block long enough to recall that some of the names associated with being chief executives and so on, who are still in place, went through quite a topsy-turvy phase some time ago. I have in mind Mr. Garma from Transnet. Are you going to be looking at these old issues again? And are there more people in your mind that need to be investigated in top positions in these state-owned enterprises? Are there more than? Are we going to be seeing more suspensions, prosecutions, and so forth? Can you give us a sort of an idea of the quantum of these?
Okay, thanks. Let the minister respond, and I'll give you the second chance. Minister.
Thank you. SA Express, I think many of these entities are going to require, let's call it legitimate cash for operational purposes. And our, I think, experience and understanding is that if you have the right boards with the right kind of experience and insights, but also the courage and the boldness to do the right things, plus an effective management team, many of these entities can, and SA Express certainly as well, pull themselves out of the trouble that they find themselves in. Why do I say that? The entities like SA Express find themselves where they are because of the fact that the focus became the question, how can I steal? Right? Rather than how can I make this airline run properly? And once you begin to lose your focus, and if the intent is extraction for yourself, for your friends, for businesses that you are associated with, for earning kickbacks from deals that you actually make, then obviously you're going to find yourselves in trouble because your focus is not how to get the business right. So there's, I think if I cross over to the other question as well, we currently might have a situation where SA Express, Mango, and SAA all fly to the same destination. Bringing the airlines together and rationalizing their routes, and more importantly, rationalizing the kind of aircraft needed at a particular time in day, of day. So if traffic is thin, so to speak, at midday, why use a big aircraft? Use a smaller aircraft. And that's the experience from that we are beginning to learn from airlines around the world. Different gauge aircrafts for different destinations at different times of the day. So it's that synergy and savings, and there will be other areas of rationalization as well. So our net guess is that by putting the airlines together, we can actually go through a transition period where there are going to be difficulties. And I think more recently there have been some good pieces written by your constituency, understanding the reality that closing down something is far more expensive than operating it and taking it into a more survivalistic mode and then more successful mode at a later point in time. Secondly, if you have something that's dysfunctional and you want to try and sell it, you're going to get very little for it. So the real challenge, I think, for us is putting the right people in the right places, both on boards and management teams, both at a business level and technical level, and having the right oversight and accountability over them so that we know that they're actually doing the right things. It also means that in the department, we need the technical capability to understand what all these entities are doing. And that's another process that we are involved in at the moment. So I wouldn't see this as a bailout, but there are talks with the Treasury to get some short-term cash. I mean, if you need to buy tires, you need to buy tires. And if you don't have the cash at the moment, then you need a bit of cash facility so that you can get aeroplanes off the ground. And if you do, you'll earn revenue. And if you earn a reputation, again, for punctuality and serving the secondary cities and other less popular routes in South Africa well, you'll draw customers again. And that begins a virtuous cycle as we go forward. SAA is not with us at the moment, Linda, so there was no commitment letter from me to SAA, probably from Minister Nene. So I told you it's early in the morning. I told you it's early in the morning. Now, Mr. Lamola has been chosen because he's been practicing corporate law for the last 10 years. He runs his own company. He's got a master's in corporate law and I think another master's as well. So he's not somebody who's not a professional. And what we've done in many of the boards, on all the boards, is try to get a gender balance right, try to get the balance between experienced and younger people right, give new opportunities to young professionals, lawyers, accountants, engineers, so that another generation of board members can actually learn from the more experienced ones and ensure that we have enough people there with the right integrity and leadership to steer entities and those boards and management teams in the right kind of direction. So that's the broad objective that we've tried to accomplish. Jan, on the municipal debt issue, I think it's going to take us some time to unravel the spaghetti, but amongst the things that we need to look at, which we will do shortly more intensely, because otherwise you get into this tangle which says you owe us pay. And the other response will be, we can't pay, we don't have money. And then you get locked into a gridlock that you can't get out of. So in the first instance, we've got to look at whether municipalities have the right collection capability. Secondly, what's the compliance culture in various communities? In other words, the willingness to pay. Thirdly, what is the relationship between Eskom and the municipalities? So there are some odd practices that have crept in over time, where, for example, it appears they have a ceiling for each municipality and area in terms of the amount of power that they think that municipality will draw at the maximum. And if you go past the maximum, for whatever reason, you attract a penalty. But that penalty, if you go past that maximum for 1 hour, I think the penalty is for 4 months. 6 months. Right, so 1 hour equals 6 months. Now, that can't be fair. So we want to look at the pricing policy of Eskom as well and ask the board to do that more carefully and unravel all of these different elements. And at the end of the day, once we get some of the technical aspects, right, it's going to be about political will. Are we going to start engaging with communities, which we should, to explain how electricity works and its pricing works and how the sustainability of institutions like Eskom works? So I think we have a reasonable grasp of the issues. We must now get down to not just the talking, but making some moves to cut, that's an unfortunate pun, but the Gordian knot, and so that we can start a process of transformation around municipalities themselves. I've answered the merger point. SAA coming back to DPE, we anticipate that it would. I think it's a question of timing. Paul, difficult to get people on the board? Right now, no. You can see the kind of people that have made themselves available. And I think if we now look at the responses to the advert that we've placed so that we can scrap the old database and create a new one, we get Tumamina offers like literally every day. The question is, where do we fit people in? And how do we use the kind of skills and experience that they actually come with? And the President yesterday repeated that call to all South Africans. How do we share skills, and how do we help each other to build South Africa and take it in the right direction? Clearly, if there are reputational issues, nobody wants to be associated with badly run entities or entities that have got themselves into difficulties. So it's very understandable if somebody else had problems in this regard in the past. I'm sure you're not surprised either. Reduce Eskom's risk to the fiscus. I think that's the overall objective, and that's the work in progress. And perhaps in the next, say, 2 months, the board would have had enough time to look into some of these issues, as would we and government more generally. And our aim is certainly to reduce Eskom as a risk and turn Eskom into an asset as far as both the fiscus is concerned. There was a time when Eskom paid big amounts in tax, which I hope it still does. I'm no longer the tax man, so I don't know. But also, many of these entities used to pay dividends to the state as well, and I think that's an important point to get to from its commercial activities. Donald, no, the boards must look at whatever they need to look at. And so across the board, as I indicated earlier on, the boards have, if you like, 3 broad sets of functions. The first is to clean up the past. So investigate what needs to be investigated, pursue charges if they are necessary and legitimate, and clear people out of the system that are going to be toxic in these institutions. The second is to stabilize the institution, both in governance terms, in financial terms, and in terms of the morale of the staff and management in these institutions. The third is to look into the future, right, and say, how are we going, where do we want to position these institutions as we go into the next 5 to 10 years? For example, the energy terrain is changing every day. Right? There are people getting off the grid, on the grid, starting their own grids and what have you. Now, if you remain static on the basis of a view developed 5 years ago, then you'll run, like any other business, you'll run into trouble. So if you want an example, maybe 10 years ago, all of you used Nokia phones, right? Nokia has virtually disappeared, except for the small burner phones that they now market. And the question is why? All of you used to be proud Kodak users. That's gone as well. Motorola, that's gone as well. So those are very good business examples of the kind of stuff that people have to actually deal with as we go forward. So those are the 3 core tasks that these entities and their boards and management teams have to look at.
Okay, thanks, Minister. Can I, last page. Pretoria, any question, Ismail?
Thanks, Chairperson. Yes, we do have a question from Pretoria.
Okay, go ahead.
It's Terence, Creamer Engineering News. Thanks, Minister. Just on what we've learned over the last few years is that people matter, and the new people at these boards are going to matter very much. How have you vetted these people in such a short time? And what safeguards have you got in place if you find that maybe you've chosen the wrong people? And I did one name that didn't seem to come up was Alana Kinsley from the Transnet board. If you could just confirm whether that name is still on the board. And then the President made an announcement around the President SOE Council. And I was wondering if you could just talk about how the relationship is going to work between the Council, the boards, your department, the executives, and how you see that transitioning to some sort of governance end state for state-owned companies, and what that end state could look like. And then besides Mr. Hadebe's name on the Eskom list, I think the name was also put forward for CFO of Eskom. Was that considered, or was that a board competence? And then just on Eskom again, and on the 3 imperatives: clean up, stabilize, and look to the future. And looking to the future, how much leeway have you given the Eskom board and the executives in terms of looking to that future with the corporate plan coming up in September? You mentioned the changes that are taking place in that environment of energy, but also in terms of asset sales or the radical restructuring of Eskom, whether it's going to be just a cleaning up of what we have, or whether we can envisage something more dramatic in terms of the structure of Eskom. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Pretoria. Let me start with Hajra, and then you come.
Thank you. Hajra Marji from Power 987. Minister, you said on struggling SOEs, closing them down something is more expensive than survival or building a more successful entity. Now, in that regard, the President yesterday spoke about looking at accountability as well as the liquidity of some SOEs. Where is the debate right now? Is it possibly selling off non-strategic assets in SOEs, or is it looking at a shareholder model where perhaps government still owns 51%, but you sell off a percentage? Can you give us more detail on that? And then also on the issue around how these SOEs will be governed. I think it was before the Davos meeting where Ramaphosa, he was dealing with the Eskom matter at the time, and he said he doesn't believe the shareholder needs to manage SOEs, but simply play an oversight role. So what will government's relationship be with the boards, and what will the board's relationship be with the management? Yeah, I hope I make sense.
Okay, Lamise from Fin24. Part of the mandate for the boards is to investigate allegations of corruption and then take action or recover the monies. And so just regarding Eskom, those that resigned, if it is found through the investigations that those people are implicated, will action be taken against them? Against those at Eskom who have resigned?
The last one, yes.
Lindsay Dentlinger, Eyewitness News. Minister, last week your department placed an advert calling on people to apply to be members of the boards. Is that for the boards that you still mentioned, or for the companies that you've mentioned that still require boards, or are you hoping to create some type of database of people that you can draw from when you need to?
Okay. Minister, you can go ahead.
No, thank you. I didn't know there was somebody called Pretoria in Pretoria.
It was Terence Kramer.
It was Terence, okay. Yeah. You're absolutely right, Terence, that people matter. And sometimes you have instances where for a particular period of time somebody might appear to be absolutely clean, with integrity, and suddenly there's a twist in the tail, as we're learning over the last few years. So human beings have their fragility as well. So the mechanism that we have is that of a special general meeting in terms of the Companies Act, and Section 71 of the Companies Act entitles us to, as a shareholder, call into question any board member if we have sufficient proof of malfeasance or impropriety or whatever the case might be. But also that section requires us to hear people out. And you asked about some of the other names earlier on. So we have meticulously listened to people who were on the previous board, given them an opportunity to state their case, considered very carefully what their case was, if they wanted to remain, if they wanted to resign, well, that was a different matter, which was the case with Ms. Kinley. And then we decide what kind of mix of skills we need, which I spelled out earlier on, and do a search of our own from the old database, but also by talking to different types of organizations. And that's the mix that we have at the moment. So the Companies Act allows us to review the boards, and in any event, if you like, the contract between the board member that is appointed and government, or the shareholder, is that you are appointed for 3 years, subject to an annual review. So that's part of the conditionality that's actually built in. So if there's anything extraordinary, there are legal mechanisms. These are not arbitrary. These are legal mechanisms to ensure that we can get the right thing done. On Ms. Kinley, she decided not to continue, so that is why her name doesn't appear. On the SOE Council, and that's linked to Hajra's point as well, that's something that the President announced yesterday. I think he will give the public and yourselves a better feel once he has an opportunity, perhaps this afternoon when he responds to the debate on his budget vote. But let's wait for some clarity from his side or from the later briefing that you would get from Cabinet. It's not my place to speak on behalf of him or Cabinet in that particular regard. Mr. Hadebe and CFO, well, the board considered a set of names. There were initially, I think, over 200 and something applicants or names that they had before them. They narrowed it down to a number, and then they interviewed people, and they then came up with the suggestion which we have just announced. And the CFO position is also under consideration by the board at Eskom itself. Does Eskom have the leeway to do what it wants to do? I think in the first instance, remember that Eskom is an implementer of policy that is developed by the Department of Energy and adopted by government. That policy is articulated in the Integrated Resource Plan. A new Integrated Resource Plan is due sometime soon, as Minister Hadebe, the Minister of Energy, has announced. And it is in that context that Eskom will then look at what it does and what its role is, and the board will then determine how Eskom is to implement the decisions that government makes in that regard. Secondly, in looking at the operating model or the business model of each of these entities, clearly the boards will have to review whether structures actually match strategy and the objectives that we've actually set for ourselves. And if there is a need to review some of these elements, there is a government policy, I think, adopted in about 2016 and recommended by the Presidential Review Committee, you might remember it, of about 2012. And we will then look at what the propositions are. But I think the SOE Council will give the President an opportunity to get a more integrated view of all of these entities, because only some of them belong to us. Others not belong, but report to us. Others report elsewhere. So I think there'll be lots of developments in this regard in the next few months that you can look forward to. Accountability and liquidity of SOEs and sales, the same answer that I've given up to now applies there. And you're right, we need to get the balance right, but also the roles clarified between what's the government shareholder role, what's the board role, and what's the management role. But one of the lessons of the recent past is that you can have events like state capture that can actually distort all of those roles. And so whilst on the one hand, in the textbooks, it's very clear what each role player needs to do, I think the circumstance before one at a particular point in time will determine what actually is needed to be done. Louise, your question about people who've resigned and whether action will be taken, I think both at the President and in our budget vote we've said that the fact that you've resigned doesn't exempt you from any follow-up investigation in respect of an individual's role in state capture and in stealing money from institutions. Where that is the case, and there are NGOs that are operating on this terrain as well. An NGO like OUTA has laid many charges against many different individuals. The question is what's been happening with those charges and whether they're being taken forward by the relevant authorities. So resignation is by no means